Okay, as I say, we've got a lot to talk about, so I'll rapidly run through them if that's possible. I'm going to talk about a remarkable man, Winsford's Inspector of Nuisances, a remarkable man in an unremarkable town. This all started when we found some books in a bungalow in Whitegate, and these were the books, and these were in a dusty, not dirty, a dusty loft in a bungalow in Whitegate, and they turned out to be reports by the Winsford Medical Officer of Health from the 1800s to the 1930s, and the chap that brought them to me, I thought, oh, this is a load of rubbish, but I thought I'd have a quick look at them. And it transpired that they were the Medical Officer of Health's reports from that period, but appended to the reports were the reports of the Winsford's Inspector of Nuisances. Well, I'd never heard of an Inspector of Nuisances, so I read on. And from the late 1800s through to the early 1900s, the Inspector of Nuisances was Ralph Oakes. Well, I'd never heard of Ralph Oakes, but I read on, and suddenly I thought, oh my goodness, there's Thomas Hickson. Thomas Hickson's my great-grandfather. And I knew he'd been the sanitary inspector, but I didn't know he was the Inspector of Nuisances. But let's move on from there. So we will pick him up again in a moment. It is a story about Thomas Hickson, what he did, but it's also a potted history of the development of Winsford's infrastructure from 1875 through to the 1930s. I've compared this with other towns, and it doesn't vary a great deal, but bear with me. It's set against the comments that were made in Victorian times for the state to interfere in public health, but naturally there was much opposition because it was going to take money. It wasn't until a chap called Edwin Chadwick published his book in 1842 that people started to sit up and take notice, because he linked health with the environmental conditions and the places that they were working in. His book was called The Sanitary Conditions of the Labouring Population. It's a bit of a boring read, as you can imagine, but there's some interesting things in it. And he's got all sorts of pictures in there. Here we have 21 people it's in Gray's Inn Lane, that's right. And the book is littered with pictures of this type. Now, it seemed to spark the government into some sort of, well, let's do something. It introduced the Nuisance Removal Act, which defined the conditions considered unfit for humans in living accommodation. And they followed it up in 1848 with the first Public Health Act. And this was probably the first acceptance by Queen Victoria's government of taking responsibility for the health of the nation. But nothing happened. There was some work done in Birmingham and in Manchester and in London, but the small towns, very little happened. The act was toothless. There was no compulsion for towns to act. So several years later, as you can see, 1872, a further Public Health Act was passed through Parliament, which demanded that urban areas appoint medical officers and put together a plan to move the towns forward. And they were given the very specific duties to pave streets, to construct sewers and to drain houses, to check the spread of disease, and most importantly, to improve the social conditions of the poorer classes. Well, let's look at Winsford's response. Now, again, this is set against the fact that Winsford was a pretty awful place to live in the 1800s. Some people might say it's awful now, but it was worse then, believe me. And Fletcher Moss, who was a parson from Alderley Edge, he used to cycle around Cheshire. He cycled around South Lancashire and in Shropshire. And he wrote, as we left Middlewich, and they got off the train at Middlewich, and approached Winsford on our bicycles, the sun began to darken. The stench was horrible, and what should have been green fields were tracts of blackened slime, where trees stood gaunt and withered. So pretty awful thing to write, really. I mean, he didn't say anything like that about Middlewich, which was just as bad. And when he got to the middle of Winsford, he's going up the big hill, and he's saying, we trundle our bicycles amid perfumes indescribable. It would be a relief to have a few whiffs of the Ship Canal. The steep hill and the filth reminds one of Colebrookdale, but here the stinks are worse. Mm. So pretty unflattering, really, to say. But having said that, oh yeah, I should show the picture that we have of Fletcher Moss on his bicycle with his entourage. He's got a load of ladies with him, as you can imagine. Nice, good parson, obviously. And he's taking all these ladies around on their bikes. But, you know, this was it. But we can sympathize with him, because Winsford is lucky in some respects because of all the subsidence that occurred as a consequence of the salt production. The whole of Winsford was photographed in 1892. Virtually every house was photographed, so that if there were claims for subsidence, then they'd be able to look back at the old photographs. But this is the bottom of Winsford. This is the town centre in 1892. Mm-hmm. And as you can see, it looks pretty crappy, if you'll excuse my French. This is an unmade road. There's a bit of a pavement here. The reason that's raised up is that the road used to flood quite regularly at that time. Nowadays, it's Northwich that floods. And this is the big hill he was going up when he made those comments. This is the Waterman's Church at the top. And behind here, you can see lots of chimneys. Well, these are the chimneys associated with the salt works. And these ones here that you can see immediately in front of you are from Hamlet Salt Works. And that's Elizabeth Morris's great-grandfather's salt works, which you'll know about. This is another picture. This is Wharton Hill. As you can see, pretty dirty place. And the carcasses hanging outside Brooks's butcher's shop. And this was the reason for the film.
Bradford.
It's what? Bradford. These are the salt works. Now, those of you that have been to the Lion Salt Works will have some impression of what it looked like. But we look here at these first three buildings, and that's twice the size of the Lion Salt Works. Multiply the Lion Salt Works by 40, and you'll get some idea of the size of the salt works in Winsford. There were 240 chimneys, belching out dirty smoke, and that's what caused the town to be covered in, or blanketed in really very dirty rain. The salt barons, George Hamlet amongst them, bought coal to heat the brine. I should just explain what the brine is in case you don't know it. But essentially, in this building here, there's a big bath, really, essentially, a big tank, which is 90 foot long and 30 foot wide. And that's in every one of these salt houses. And underneath that, there's a fire to boil off the water, and the salt is taken off at the side. And you can just see in this old photograph some of the salt coming off at the side. And that's what it looked like inside the salt works. And you can see these chaps are called wallers, and they are taking the salt as it crystallizes on the surface of the brine and depositing it to the side here. But the filth came from the coal. Naturally, the salt barons used the cheapest, dirtiest coal they could find. The salt was shipped up to Liverpool to be exported to all parts of the world. 1.7 million tons was shipped in 1872, and on the way back, the boats called at the St Helens Canal at Widnes to bring coal back from St Helens, and coal from St Helens was the cheapest, dirtiest coal. So what did Winsford do about all this? The first key appointment was a chap called John Henry Cook, and he was involved with Winsford for many, many years, and he was appointed clerk to the local board in 1875. He was a solicitor in Winsford, and he was associated with Winsford Council. He became clerk to the council when it was formed, and he was there for 40 years. Winsford in 1875 had no water supply, no sewers, no street lights apart from one outside the Red Lion for the London coach, so it knew where to turn right when it was on its way from Liverpool to London. Footpaths were not formed or paved, and yet by the early 1900s, some progress had been made, and the town was described in the reports of the medical officer of health as a model authority. I think he was a little exaggerating a little bit, as you'll see in a moment. But we had street lighting by the early 1900s. We had street paving, clean running water, and I put in brackets, well, almost, because as you'll see in a moment, it was far from clean. There were town waterworks and what were described as excellent sewerage provision. And I'll let you make your own mind up about this when we go through this, what the sewerage looked like. A medical officer was appointed, Thomas Garstang, but he wasn't appointed until 1890. And of course, the Act was passed in 1870 odd. So like most towns, they avoided doing it because it cost money. But they were forced into it by 1890. And the first inspector of nuisances was Ralph Oakes, again appointed in 1890. But I'm not going to concentrate on the period from 1890 through to 1916. I'm going to concentrate on Thomas Hickson, who was my great-grandfather and Anne Mann's great-grandfather, and he was a remarkable man. He was appointed in 1906, and here he is at my granddad and grandma's wedding, and here they sit in the yard of Wharton School, having had the marriage ceremony at Bethesda Prims, and there he is at the back with something of a smirk on his face, I think. But we move on from that. Who was he? Well, he was born in 1862, and he was the grandson of a chap called John Hickson, and he's famous in Winsford. He actually came from Church Minshall, a village not far from Winsford, and he was famous for having held the first ranters services in Winsford in 1849 in his house by the new railway line, the London-Glasgow line, as it went through Winsford. So as the trains rattled through, they disturbed the services. But moving on to Thomas Hickson, he lived in Crook Lane in Winsford. Again, he was a Primitive Methodist. Methodism runs right through the family, not necessarily Prims though. Some of us are United, but there we are. We'll move on from that. He married Edith Newell in 1886, another Primitive Methodist family, big Primitive Methodist family. Thomas was trustee, he was society steward, he was Sunday school superintendent and leader of the Bible class. He was also a well-known local preacher, and he drew crowds. He was on the Tarpley and Winsford circuit, and he drew crowds, especially of young women, because he was quite attractive to young women, apparently. But we won't say too much about that. Well, not too much. He started life as a shipwright. And that's a bit odd in Winsford, isn't it? Or you'd think it was. But there were 6 dockyards in Winsford in the 1800s. And he worked in Deakin's dockyard. These ships produced the boats that travelled up from Winsford and from Northwich up to Liverpool, and that I've just described, taking the salt up there and fetching coal back from St Helens. And he did a remarkable thing after working in Deakin's dockyard. He went to work in Her Majesty's dockyard in Chatham. It's a remarkable thing to do. I mean, people didn't leave their own towns in those days, and he goes traipsing off all the way to Chatham. And he spent several years at Chatham. And whilst he was there, he did exams in the sanitary inspector's exams. And when he came back, he became the Inspector of Nuisances in 1906. Here's one of the boats being launched in Winsford. This is the Monarch. This is a 400-ton boat. Again, one of the biggest boats launched, and you can see the salt works in the background. Back to the progress on the infrastructure. It was very slow between 1875 and 1916, and not until Dr. Picton was appointed the Medical Officer of Health in July 1916 on a salary of £65 per annum were improvements picked up. Now you might think, well, £65 per annum doesn't seem very much for a doctor, but he was also Medical Officer of Health for another 4 towns, so he wasn't short of a bob or two, to say the least. As I say, the progress was slow from 1875 to 1916, but the reports from 1916, the details were incredible. They went from 6-page reports to 40-page reports, and the focus was very much on Winsford improvements. They must have had a kick up the backside from somebody at that time, although that's not very clear when you read all the council minutes. But at the time, Thomas's job description was made very clear. He had to report on the physical features of the area. That's the land, the rivers, and particularly the streams flowing into the river, the social conditions, the workers' occupations, and importantly, the influence on their health. He had to report on the vital statistics, births, deaths, causes of death, notifiable diseases. I wonder how he had time to do all this. He had to report on the use of hospitals and other gratuitous medical relief. He had to identify any sanitary issues, particularly in water and the water quality, drainage, rivers and streams, which we've talked about, sewage, house refuse, and we'll go through some examples of this in a moment. The privies, how clean the privies were. He inspected everybody's privies. He inspected dwelling houses to see whether they were fit for dwelling. He had to supervise food manufacture, which is quite remarkable. He inspected all the shops and butchers and so on. And he had to look after the maternity side and child welfare. And he had to do factory inspections. This is him on a bike going around all these things, so it must have been quite a challenge. And he had to deal with all sorts of unpleasant tasks, dealing with infestations, inspecting slaughterhouses. In one instance, Joe Fitton's slaughterhouse, which was only recently demolished about 20 years ago, he found the floor of the slaughterhouse uneven and he was wading through pools of blood. So it was pretty grim, really. He had to remove dumped materials from people's backyards. In a number of instances of this, he was called to a house in Wells Street where the backyard was covered in waste and fecal material. He had to deal with infectious diseases. He was constantly disinfecting houses with mercuric chloride, which is a poisonous disinfectant. Sorry? Oh, I've got a bit of an echo now. All schools were disinfected twice a year and typically 200 houses per annum. He had to fecal material from ditches.
David.
Yeah.
If you just pause a moment, I think I'm going to have to mute everybody because I think that's why you're going.
Yes,
got a bit of an echo, which
I've
means
got a terrible echo here.
which means you'll need to unmute yourself too. So just bear with me. Sorry.
Okay.
What's that?
Okay, if you could unmute yourself, David.
Is that any better?
That should have solved it. Thank you.
Oh, what? You're marvellous. Absolutely marvellous at this technology. He had to monitor the scavengers. Now, I don't know whether you all know what scavengers are. They work between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. I'll come onto what they did in a little more detail in a moment. But they removed the material from the privies, and he had to monitor that. He had to sample the effluent on the filter bed. He had to follow up the complaints of unsound meat sent to Manchester Market. And this is interesting because Fletcher Moss, the parson that we've already met, he had something to say on unsound meat. And he said that in Cheshire, a great number of old beasts are killed to save their lives, as the country folk would say. These are transformed at Winsford, the meat being consumed wherever it can be passed off, and the butcher waxes fat, and the piemen and sausage makers flourish. I didn't realise, but Winsford was well known as a slink town where unsound meat was processed. So these are sorts of things he had to do. And then he had a particularly pleasant thing to do, inspecting the midwives quarterly, which he thoroughly enjoyed, I'm absolutely certain. This is a list of the factories and workshops that were in Winsford at the time. The population was around 11,000. I don't think we've time to go through all this in any detail. You see boat building. I did say 6 yards. This is the independent one. The other 5 yards were part of the salt works. But you can see it's everything you want to support the town. Brick making, cabinet making, corn mills, an engine and boiler maker, fustian factories, iron foundries, the big salt works, of course, and then all the boots and cloggers, bottling stores. God knows what a bottling store is. Bread makers. This is the list. This is the Home Office table that they had to put into the report every year. There's all sorts of things. Rope makers, printers, tarpaulin, and a tripe dresser, of course. You'd have to have a tripe dresser. I'm sure we all love tripe. I know my sister does. And these were all subjected to surprise visits. I put this up because there were 17 butchers in Winsford at the time, 17 butchers. And it's interesting, a couple of them, Billy Hickson in High Street and Horace Hickson, were his cousins. So it was all very much in the family. But I also should point out that the family of George Hamlet had a butcher's shop. So not only was George Hamlet one of the big salt barons, he was also feeding the people who worked for him. I don't know whether it was with unsound meat. I've not been able to get to that point, but that's but it's interesting that he was involved in everything. He made bricks, he made salt, so obviously feeding the population as well. Now this is interesting, and no need to spend a lot of time. Let's just look at the bottom line here. These are all the inspections he made for 1913 through to 1921, and it averaged around 4,000 to 5,000 for the years immediately before and during the early part of the war. And then in 1916, 10,000 inspections. It's absolutely incredible because they didn't work Sundays, of course. He had a Saturday afternoon off to go and watch Winsford United. So he was working 5.5 days a week. And that meant he was making 30 or 40 inspections a day. It doesn't seem possible, but he did it, and it's all recorded. So he was a pretty busy man. 1919 was exceptionally busy, as I say. 929 notices were issued for prevention of nuisances. He visited 530 houses with suspected infectious diseases, and that's probably about a quarter of the town's population. 170 of those houses were disinfected with mercuric chloride. He had to transfer infected patients to the Davenham Isolation Hospital. Winsford Isolation Hospital had closed by then. He had to disinfect all the schools during the school holidays. And of course, 1919, it was Spanish flu. So they had to disinfect virtually everything during the flu epidemic. 220 houses were overcrowded. 36 factories and 117 workshop inspections were made. He was derelict in his duty because he only managed to do 27 inspections of slaughterhouses. The 17 slaughterhouses should have been inspected 4 times a year. So he didn't do everything he should have done. And he had to inspect 1,046 privy middens, which were overflowing. He was so busy that they awarded him a salary increase to £187 per annum. Now, to put that into context, an engineer at around that time working for the Salt Union would have earned £160 per annum. So it's not a princely sum at all, £187 per annum. And I put this on because it's interesting, because this Miss Dempster was very important in Winsford. She lived in Vale Royal, the big house. You'll know Vale Royal Abbey, no doubt. Well, Miss Dempster lived in Vale Royal, and she was kept from a well-to-do family, but she did a lot of work in Winsford. And she tried to convince the Urban District Council to excuse nurses the cost of rates. And you can imagine their response. The request was declined. Miss Dempster became Edith Petty, and Edith Petty was the young woman who moved to Sutton Hoo and unearthed the Viking longship at Sutton Hoo. And she was from Winsford. So clearly there were many issues. How were they addressed? Well, there was the water issues, sewage issues, and housing issues. I'm rushing through this because I note that we've been half an hour already. As far as water was concerned, in 1875, the council paid Lord Shrewsbury £1,500 to take water from springs in Little Budworth. These were called the Stretches, the Austins, and the Butts, and they were in use. I thought when I first did this till 1920, they did extend beyond that, and again we'll come on to that in a moment. A 10-inch pipe ran to Winsford Waterworks, and there was no treatment at this stage because it was considered unnecessary. Prior to this, of course, Winsford people had taken the water from wells, or if they lived close to it, from the river, and you'll see why they shouldn't have been doing that in a moment. Water tower was constructed in 1870, and a reservoir was added in 1899 to supply Middlewich. This is Winsford. This is today's map of Winsford. Here's the river running through it, the River Weaver. On the right, as you can see, that's the Wharton parish, and on the left is the Over parish. 3 miles out of town, just after the turning for Little Budworth and Oulton Park, were the Winsford Waterworks. And you can see them clearly on the 1892 Ordnance Survey map with the 2 springs that are identified there with the reservoirs. Well, there were issues with Winsford's water supply. It was untreated, and there were every single year there were reports of an off-taste and bacterial contamination, and there was some serious bacterial contamination in 1913 with Bacillus coli, and it was due to the heavy manuring of the surrounding land. And Thomas went out on his bike to see what was going on, and he found a slimy ooze flowing into Stretches Springs. And the contamination was from a farm midden. For those of you that don't know the word midden, it's a muck heap on a farm. And this was reported to the Rural District Council, Northwich Rural District Council, but little action was taken. And it was a situation similar to this. Here's a privy with a receptacle for the waste underneath, which is leaking, and it contaminates the streams. And this boy is collecting water from the contaminated stream. So it's a similar situation to that. This is a picture of the waterworks. Not very much to see next to St. John's Church. It's all gone now. But every year they had to, or Thomas had to take samples to the Public Health Laboratory in Manchester, and samples from Stretcher Spring in 1921 showed 2,380 colonies in 1 gram of water, and 11 kinds of bacteria were identified. Now you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, the maximum number of colonies in a gram now is 20. So it was pretty contaminated. And the head of the Public Health Laboratory wrote to Winsford Council and said, although there is no evidence of fecal pollution, the number of bacteria is so great and their kind so many that the water cannot be considered safe for domestic purposes. So they had to do something about it. The council had to make a decision. And you know, councils are not very good at making decisions. It's always been the case. But in 1915, they'd purchased the right from Lord Delamere, naturally, from it wasn't Lord Delamere, it was some other lord, to extract water from Oakmere. This was considered every year in council meetings in 1916, 1917, 1918. Eventually, in 1923, they agreed to do it, 8 years after they'd bought the right. And it was a new filtration system based on Oakmere was installed with a capacity of 20,000 gallons per hour. The resulting water was to be clear and bright, free from suspended material and without a peaty taste. And a 9-inch water main conveyed the water to Whitby's Lane. The interesting thing here is they agreed to supply Roscoe Brunner's house in Little Budworth. Roscoe Brunner was head of the Brunner-Mond Company, and obviously they were very big in the area, and they agreed to supply his little house in Little Budworth, and there's his little house in Little Budworth. They went out of the way to supply Roscoe Brunner. His father, John Brunner, founded Brunner-Mond and essentially founded ICI. Here's a picture of Oakmere. I'm not going to dwell on this. This is the picture of Oakmere that was in the reports. So what was you might ask, what was the effect of the general health of the people in Winsford? Well, I've looked at those diseases that could be caused by water pollution. From the year 1910 to 23, population 10,500, 11,000. Diphtheria, unlikely to be caused by water pollution. Erysipelas, which is a skin infection caused by streptococcus. Scarlet fever, of course. Enteric fever, which is typhoid, and again caused by salmonella. And phthisis, which is TB, the old name for TB, unlikely that would be caused. But when the new plant came in, it didn't seem to make a great deal of difference. And we'll understand why in a moment. But you know, these numbers are low anyway for the population when compared to other towns. So I don't know whether it's in reviewing sickness, we should remember that this is pre-NHS, and I suspect there were considerable numbers of bouts of diarrhea and you just didn't go to the doctors because it cost money, so they weren't recorded. But you see, diarrhea mixture advertised at Clark's Chemist, bottom of Winsford, is pretty high on the agenda, and it's used with great success in the last cholera epidemic. Moving on, sewerage. Not going to spend a lot of time on this. Sewerage was a problem because there wasn't any of it. And here's this young lady having a bit of a strain. I'm going to talk very briefly about cesspool privies, pail closets, and earth closets, and what we had to do with them. Cesspool privies, called in Winsford midden closets. Water closets did exist, but they were only in a dozen or more homes in Winsford, wealthy homes. And the reason they weren't was there were concerns over river pollution costs and water supplies. Most towns use this dry conservancy system using the scavengers. There were 2,811 privies in 1899, and it consisted of a privy like this with a container sunk into the ground. The outside part is covered with a stone to allow scavenger access, and the privies were emptied every 9 weeks in the middle of the night. And they used 18-inch scoops on a 6-foot pole, and they'd scoop the waste into buckets in the yard after 10 o'clock at night and then traipse it through the house. The pail closet eventually took over from the cesspool privies, and this was seen in action in Congleton. I don't know what that actually means, but they do strange things in Congleton, as you know. But cesspool was clearly impractical and unsanitary. Scooping into the buckets in the dark with just oil lamps was very difficult. Spillage was easy. It was very difficult to empty. Rain flooded the yard, bringing all the foul from the privy up into the yard. It was generally an undesirable mess. 28 pails were installed in 1900, and this is what they look like. There's a seat underneath which a pail was placed, and the pail was emptied weekly by the scavengers. And here we have the pail underneath the seat. And this is where people put ashes, and they sprinkle the ashes onto the waste to stop the smell. Here's a picture of the night soil bucket, as it was called, which I put it alongside this toilet, see how big it was. This is in Nantwich Museum. Thomas Hickson designed his own privy, his own strainer, his own version. And this was a strainer with a perforated bottom. So it's one container inside a base pail. There's a seat on the top, a little step for those with short legs. The liquid drained through and the solid remained in the strainer. The liquid was poured onto the cabbages in the backyard, and the solid sometimes was used by the people in the houses, but generally was sent to was picked up by the scavengers. Here's a picture of a privy, the internal of a privy, and a 2-seater, which was, you could have a chat while you were doing the business, and a pail underneath, as you can see. Scavengers. This is the manual removal of human excreta by hand with buckets and scoops. Cesspool privies, the first one we talked about, were emptied every 9 weeks. Pail closets were emptied every week. Sometimes they needed emptying more than that, so quite a few were tipped in the street. Pails were carried on the backs of scavengers, and scavengers had little protection apart from caps with a neck flap to avoid spillage down the necks. So pretty awful thing to do, and he had to monitor this, of course. The scavengers received 6pence for every privy they emptied. But the interesting thing is Thomas Hickson reports on the value of the night soil, and he describes this as the manurial value of this class of night soil used fresh is very high. On cabbages and as a mulch for fruit trees, it gives excellent results. Over 10,000 tons of night soil were collected in Winsford every year. Much was sold to the market garden in Little Budworth, where Thomas notes that the farmer would open the sluice at the back of his wagon and let the horse wander over the field. So it begs the question, I'm sure we all know that Cheshire potatoes are the best. Is this the reason why Cheshire potatoes are the best? No, frankly, this happened in other towns as well. I'm not going to spend much time on sewers, because apart from saying the flushing tank started at Chester Road Chapel, there was an over sewer and a Wharton sewer. The Wharton sewer went past Bethesda Chapel. This is the 1892 picture of Bethesda Prims. This is Station Road. It was called Gravel Lane at that time. And from there, it went to the filter beds. And this is one of the filter beds here on the Wharton side. This here is his granddaughter, by the way. It's a picture of our Muriel. And here we see the picture of the sewer runs. There's the red sewer and the blue sewer for, so red sewer for Over, the blue sewer for Wharton. But in the middle, see the red and the blue go to filter beds, but in the middle where most of the activity was around, that just went straight into the into the river. So yeah, there were filter beds, but well, not for everybody. The filter beds were claimed to be the most efficient in the UK, and to the extent that Winsford District Council sold the technology to other councils, the construction was very simple. They delivered the crude sewage onto a bed of cinders 2 foot to 3 foot above river level, and the bed stood partly on land and partly in the water. The bed was raked. There were people there raking the effluent regularly as it sank into the river. There were many complaints, and man will tell you there were complaints right through to 1950s, 1960s, whenever there was heavy rain and the sewage ran straight into the river. These filter beds carried on until the town became a new town in the 1960s. Sampling was impossible. He reports that on several occasions I sunk deep into the effluent. The medical officer of health had recommended a new system, and this is how it was. The effluent sludge coming in is the cinders. The cinders came from the salt works, from all the coal that was burned. Here's the River Weaver and the river bank. It's as simple as that. And those were the sophisticated filter beds that carried on right through. Albert Buckley was the manager there right through to 1960. Housing. And running through this now, I've got 5 minutes left, haven't I? This is what most people's houses look like, with a little settle there and a range, and they lived in this house. And there could be a dozen people living in houses like this. This is overcrowding in Manchester. It wasn't as bad as that in Winsford, but we had our moments. And here's Hill Street, which it was an awful place, Hill Street. These are the Bass houses. I haven't got really time to talk about the Bass houses. They were made from clinker from the salt works. And Mr. Falk built these. He was one of the salt barons. And you see, they were terrible places, always damp, full of cockroaches. And the 1909 Town Planning Act prevented the building of back-to-back houses. Local authorities had to introduce systems of town planning, and homes had to be built to legal standards. Winsford, as you'd expect, did very little. Housing issues continued. In 1911, there were no empty houses in Wharton. There was a shortage of houses for the working class. There were 11 large houses in Over, but they weren't suitable for the working classes, as you can imagine. 33 houses in Princes Street, that was a pretty downtrodden area then, with privy middens, no ash pits, dirty floors, damp interiors, overrun with cockroaches, completely refurbished and had to be disinfected with mercuric chloride. Similarly, in Hill Street, 65 houses had to be disinfected with mercuric chloride. And so it goes on. These are just examples. 1913, 124 houses were unsatisfactory and disinfected with mercuric chloride. It made him ill because this mercuric chloride was a poison. And it was getting to his insides, basically. Assistant was urgently requested. The council meeting notes said they will consider the matter, but they didn't give him any more assistance. But they did agree to pay him £1 for bicycle maintenance. At that time, the medical officer's health stated that cannot think that the council would wish to appear in the list of councils characterised as inadequate. New houses finally came along in 1919. 40 houses were built for the working classes in Crook Lane. In 1920, still continuing, yards and privies overflowing, diphtheria outbreak in Greenfield, cottages alongside the waterworks. They then moved on to psyllin as a disinfectant because they realised that mercuric chloride was poisonous. This is a formaldehyde derivative. But it continued. Overcrowding persisted. In one instance, parents, 2 grown-up sons, 4 children and a baby were in one single and one double bedroom. Mr. Falk's Bass houses had to be disinfected with psyllin. Eventually, 1928, getting on for 20 years after they were supposed to do something, a surveyor was appointed and they started some serious building. a programme of construction started, but only because there was a government subsidy which limited rents to 5 and 10 pence to 6 bob. These are the houses. If super houses are as good, at least as good as what's being built now, I would suggest. And on the right-hand side here, you see the living room, a scullery, I didn't call them kitchens at that point, a bathroom with a bath, a water closet, outside lavatory, coal, and there was a back to, this is the upstairs of next door, so there would have been a mirror image of this. But so nice little houses and decent sized bedrooms compared to what you see now with some of the small houses. I mentioned there was plenty of medical support. There were 5 doctors in the town at the time for only 11,000 in 1931. And they were paid 10 and 6 for every childbirth. They had Mrs. Joynson on a salary of £104 per annum. She was the health visitor. And I bring this lady up, Constance Hamlet, because again, it's Elizabeth Morris's great aunt. And she married one of the Hamlets from the salt works. By 1929, we had reliable potable water supply, street lighting, York stone pavements. Whatever happened to those? All the pavements were York stone on the main highways. They've all disappeared now. It's terrible now. Sewers, had new sewers, and I maybe shouldn't have said efficient sewers, filter beds, but we had them. Separate storm sewers and water closets were on the increase. Housing was beginning to increase 1929 with new houses built in what's known as Kingsway. It had been a long haul. It had taken 50 years to reach this stage. And the workload by now were really taking its toll on Thomas. And he was admitted to the Albert Infirmary, where he was a familiar and frequent visitor. He had a bit of a dalliance with the matron, apparently, but we won't say too much about that. And there's the Albert Infirmary with matron, and he's standing outside there for the extension of the... And finally, he died in October 1929 in the Albert Infirmary, aged 66. Now, I finish off by saying he wasn't a lone fighter in improving Winsford's infrastructure, but I think we can agree that he played his part. That's it. I have rushed through it.